Hello, students. Here we go for week 29. We're going to get started on learning about the 1960s. You know that we're not going to be meeting again in class for the rest of the year, sadly. So we're going to finish it all like this. And, we have our final project coming up, and I still expect that, and I'm thinking that last day we'll try to Zoom that, and I'll get back with you as far as how to do that. I think I'll have y'all send me your PowerPoints. You're going to pick a person to do a biography about and then make a PowerPoint of them. Okay, I'll get more word to you as we get a little closer. Okay, so we're going to get started here with the 1960s. Okay, this is a decade of wild change. We're kind of transitioning over from that 50s idyllic lifestyle to a rebellion and things like this. We have a war and this kind of thing going on. All right, so we're going to start with the election in 1960. Oh, no, we're not. We're going to start with Starburst. They were invented in 1960. How fun. I had some of these for you. I ate them all. Not really. I didn't eat any. But I would have had these for you. Not sure if you like those or not. All right, there's an election in 1960. Sorry that Richard Nixon's name is cut off there a little bit. Richard Nixon was the vice president under Eisenhower, and so he was pretty well known politically. And then he was running against John F. Kennedy. All right, so we see him here. He's young, vigorous, war hero. Remember, we saw how he had that heroic action on the PT boat in World War II. So he was pretty well known. He had written the book called the Profiles in Courage about brave people in the past, that kind of thing. And he was young and handsome and exciting, and this was one of the first debates that was televised. Okay, so here we are looking at a television screen. Yeah, it looks pretty bad as far as video quality goes. And we can see we have Nixon over here sitting sort of uncomfortable looking, and meanwhile, JFK is over here just smooth, cool as a cucumber. Furthermore, the lights were really hot, and which is typical on a TV set, and it caused Nixon to sweat a lot. So here he is wiping the sweat off of his face, and look at JFK over there, just cool and calm and handsome, right? So that was one of the things that sort of led people to think that JFK might be a good candidate. So the election took place, and you can see here it's pretty even. Look at the popular vote right here. It is very, very close. Okay, so 49.6 to 49.7 right there. So very close. We had a little more movement for the Democrat over here in the Electoral College. But you can see it was very close. There was, of course, a third party. That would be the Independent Dixiecrat Party. We learned about them a little bit last time. They are in the Deep South right there. But notice they didn't make a whole lot of headway there. Interestingly, we can see that, like Florida, for instance, it went Republican, but the rest of the South pretty much went Democrat, which was fairly normal at the time, right? And then we have, some others up here as well. So there was a problem with Kennedy that the people were, one of the reasons he was not voted for, was not popular, was because he was Catholic. So we had not had a Catholic president prior to this. You may remember the guy named Al Smith had run, and he was a Catholic and did not get elected. And so now this is going to be our first, and I believe I'm right if I say our only Catholic president at the time. Because you remember there were these, these people down in the South especially who were, and some of those clubs that just thought that Catholics were very suspicious and this kind of thing, kind of lumped them in with communists and Jews and things like that. Well, so the election took place. Here's Kennedy with his vice presidential candidate right here. He picked a man from Texas. And the reason he did this was because Texas Democrats needed to be a little bit more convinced to vote for a Catholic. All right, because they're down in the South and they needed to have something there. So he picked a popular Texas Democrat, and his name is Lyndon Baines Johnson. He had been in the Senate at the time, one of the best legislators ever, and he will continue to be that way. Now, Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson didn't really like each other all that much. Johnson was much more of a good old boy Democrat, and Kennedy wanted to have maybe some compromise and things like this. So Kennedy got elected, all right, like we saw by that kind of slim margin there. And now we have ushering in this young, beautiful couple who are becoming the first family, right? So this is his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. She was a style setter. We're going to see. So he's president number 35, right? And this is his inaugural speech. So there he is sitting there. And you can see there's his vice president. Notice who that is. That's Richard Nixon, right? Because he was the sitting vice president at the time, so he was there. And Kennedy gave his speech that day, and a famous quote from that is, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So a pretty good quote right there. So now we're looking at this young, vigorous family. Camelot is hearkening back to the days of King Arthur in England, right? So where there was this great change and this justice and all these great, chivalrous codes that were going on. And so also at the time there was a musical on Broadway called Camelot, and it was talking about Arthur, and it was very popular at the time. In fact, Jackie and Jack, that's John Kennedy's nickname, loved going to see that show. And so somebody thought that this would be kind of a good name for them, to call them Camelot, this new kind of idea of greatness and justice. This is their little boy, John Kennedy Jr., known as John John, and their daughter Caroline, sweet Caroline. This was what we got to see, pictures like this. So here he is at his desk, doing the business of state. And look under there, a little door pops out. Who's down there? His little son. And everybody found this to be just adorable. And it was just exciting to have a young family in the White House. Meanwhile, his wife was the trendsetter, the style setter. Anywhere she went, people wanted to see what was she wearing. And then they wanted to dress like she would. And so everything was a big hit. She was a big proponent of this pillbox hat right there, which became very, very popular. Notice other hats as well. But very stylish, very popular. This is his brother-in-law. His name is Sargent Shriver. Sargent's his first name. And he was married to John Kennedy's sister, I believe Eunice, if I'm not mistaken about that. And he tapped him. He said, "I'd like you to do something for me. We're going to start up this new thing, this thing called the Peace Corps." It's still around. The Peace Corps is there. It's kind of like a secular version of a missionary going to another land and doing something good for them. A missionary, of course, would be telling them about Christ. In this particular case, they're going to build something, work on some infrastructure, maybe make a bridge or a road or something like this. We're going to watch a little video about it. These are the places where we sent representatives to do work for the Peace Corps. I think the dark blue is where we had the major presence, and then the lighter blue was a less present. Notice there's Russia right there, which we were still in the Cold War here, so I find that interesting. Let's just watch a little film about it.
Interest in President Kennedy's proposed Peace Corps continues to rise among American youth. Here are the forerunners of the Peace Corps. American exchange students, now overseas in backward and depressed areas of the world, giving of their strength, skills, and education in tasks similar to the missions that will be assigned to Peace Corps members. Popular response to the Peace Corps proposal, with thousands of inquiries pouring in before application forms were even ready, is a measure of the younger generation's readiness to accept a bold challenge to positive action. Now, following up his initial announcement, President Kennedy appears before newsreel cameras in the White House to outline the program and the prospects of the global Peace Corps.
The Peace Corps is really the idea of the American people. When I talked last fall about the idea of young American men and women going abroad to serve shoulder to shoulder with the citizens of newly emerging countries, a tremendous response went up from the schools and colleges of the United States. In the last few months, more applications for the Peace Corps have come to us than have come for positions in all the rest of the United States government put together. What is remarkable is that there is no salary for the members of the Peace Corps. They will go abroad and live on the same standard as people of other countries, that they will work with them 2 or 3 years, devoting part of their lives to peace and to strengthening the ties that bind men together all over the globe, who are capable and well-trained. and who will be welcomed by other countries. Our Peace Corps, I want to emphasize, is not designed as a weapon of propaganda, is not designed as a tool in the Cold War. It is a genuine effort by the people of the United States, particularly those who are young, to play their part in working for peace, in improving the lives of all mankind. It comes, I think, from a deep, historic, and revolutionary experience that we have had. The people of this country are anxious to see a world in peace. Young people in this country are anxious to hold out their hands to people in other worlds. They will learn as much as they will teach.
Okay, so you see there how that was an effort then that he wanted to extend the American way. And even though he said it wasn't part of a Cold War, arm, it really sort of served that way. So the Cold War is still going on against Russia, namely, so the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic. And over in Russia, we have a leader. This is a picture of his. So we have Kennedy down here. His name is Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev was sort of this grandfather figure, but he was solid communist through and through. And he was definitely working at taking over the world, which is what communists want to do. One of the things he wanted to do was to isolate the people in West Berlin. So to remember that West Germany and East Germany had been separated after the war, there were other places in the world we'll learn about that were also separated, namely in Korea, North and South Korea, which we've already seen, and then we'll be looking at North and South Vietnam, all because of that settlement at the end of the war. So you remember Berlin is completely in East Germany, and now they're going to surround the entire, so this is Berlin, inside, all inside East Germany. The entire city, the sectors here, will be completely surrounded by a wall known as the Berlin Wall. We're going to watch a little video on it in just a minute, but you can see here the American sector here. There's a gate to get into, so if you want to come in from the Russian sector and get into the American sector, right here, you have to go through this gate, and the name of that gate is Checkpoint Charlie, which became rather famous. Let's watch the little video about it.
The Berlin Wall, 1961 to 1989. The Cold War. The Berlin Wall would become a symbol of ideological division and suppression of human rights during the Cold War. In August 1961, the communist government of the German Democratic Republic of East Germany began construction of the wall and placement of barbed wire between West Berlin and the East. Its purpose was to stop Western fascists from entering the socialist state of East Germany and stopping defections from East to West. It would continue to do so until November 9, 1989, when the East German regime announced that its citizens had the right to cross the border when they wanted. The wall goes up. When World War II came to an end in 1945, the victors came together at the Yalta and Potsdam Conference to split Germany into 4 Allied occupation zones. East Germany would go to the Soviet Union, while the western part went to the United States, Great Britain, and France. Even though Berlin was located entirely within the Soviet part of the country, the city would be split into 4 sectors in the same way. The Russians were determined to remove the United States, Britain, and France from Berlin. A Soviet blockade in 1948 attempted to starve them from the city. However, the United States and its allies resisted by dropping food and fuel supplies from aircraft, which became known as the Berlin Airlift. The booming western sector, which was the showcase of capitalism, contrasted sharply to the economically poorer east. Many German refugees flowed from east to west, including highly skilled workers such as doctors, teachers, and engineers. Between 1945 to 1961, 15 to 20% of the East German population had left to the west. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, had had enough and gave the East German government permission to close the Berlin borders for good. On the night of August 12 through 13, 1961, East German soldiers, the police force, and volunteer construction workers laid down barbed wire and a concrete block wall which stretched over 100 miles. Escaping East Berlin. Berliners would no longer be able to cross freely with ease to work, shop, or go to the cinema as they had done before. Now, in order to get from east to west, they had to pass through one of 3 checkpoints. Checkpoints Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. In October 1961, U.S. Chief of Mission in West Berlin, E. Allen Leitner, was stopped in his car by East German police. This prevention of access for American officials to East Berlin caused a standoff between American and Soviet tanks, which faced off at Checkpoint Charlie. For many hours, both sides stared each other down, waiting for the enemy to fire. The potential for World War III was eventually averted when President John F. Kennedy contacted Nikita Khrushchev and convinced him to withdraw his tanks. The American tanks also backed away soon after. Armed soldiers patrolled the wall and would shoot anyone on sight attempting to escape. Ditches, barbed wire, guard dogs, searchlights, and minefields were all also set up to prevent escape attempts. Buildings overlooking the wall were demolished or had their windows bricked up so that people could not escape by jumping from them. At least 171 people were killed trying to cross the wall. But this didn't mean escape was impossible. Hundreds of East Germans tried to escape across the wall, including by flying a hot air balloon, by zipline, on a tightrope, in a car without a windshield, by swimming, and through a tunnel. While President John F. Kennedy protested, he realized a wall was better than war. The Berlin Wall had diffused tension and stopped the flow of refugees from East Berlin. The fall of the wall. On November 9th, 1989, with the Cold War thawing and political changes happening across the Eastern Bloc, the Eastern German government announced that all GDR citizens could visit West Germany and West Berlin. Crowds of East Germans crossed and climbed onto the wall and celebrated with West Germans on the other side. People knocked down the wall with hammers, and soon, with the help of bulldozers, it was pulled down. The reunification of East and West Germany was made official on October 3rd, 1990.
So we'll learn about that part when it happens, as far as the fall of the wall. But the actual, the wall going up right there was kind of considered a failure for Kennedy's administration, because it was keeping, the freedom to the guys in East Berlin. And so he wanted to come visit West Berlin to make sure they realized we were, supporting them, and wanted to make sure that they would continue to be free and be part of a capitalist type of economy. So he decided to come and visit. It was a big deal. Here he is on the motorcade coming to make a speech with the leader of West Berlin, and he gave a big speech. We saw a little bit in that video just then, with him standing with the red behind him. So he has another famous line here when he came up to tell the people, and those of you who can speak German can do this better than I can, but it's "Ich bin ein Berliner," which he's basically saying, I am a Berliner. In other words, I am from Berlin, like you, right? But it just so happens that a Berliner is a type of pastry. So it kind of was like he was saying, I am a jelly donut. All right, so some people, found that funny. But they understood, of course, what he meant and this kind of thing. So he is trying to make sure and keep that relationship alive right there, because there's trouble brewing closer to home. And that is in Cuba. So you can see right here is Florida. If you remember, Cuba, we had assisted them in getting their independence from Spain back in the Spanish-American War, and we had told them that we would give them their independence when we fight for it. We kept a base down here somewhere, the Guantanamo base. We'll see it in just a minute. But at this point in time, there was actually a revolution in Cuba. All right, so the people were unhappy. There were some rich people and some very, very poor people. And the poor people wanted a little more access to the economy and to the good life. And so this man came along. His name is Fidel Castro, and he started giving speeches and letting the people know that they could rise up against these rich people. And so what happened at this point is that a revolution actually began. The rich people fled. They left Cuba. They went to Florida, because see how close it is right there. And other people too, not all just the rich people, but other people who disagreed with the idea of communism. And they fled to Florida. And then, of course, they're looking for help from America. They're saying, help us to keep this communist dictator from taking over our land. Now, he did become the president, or the head of Cuba, if you will. So here we can see Guantanamo Bay is right down here. So that is American land. It's a naval base. It is still there today. Okay, and then I want you to notice a little area here. So there's a little inlet right here. It's called the Bay of Pigs. So the people who had fled Cuba, the nationalists who were against the communists, found that Americans supported them in being anti-communist as well. And so there was a push to try to have a counterinsurgence, counter-revolution, to take the island back. And in one particular case, we had some involvement of our government. It was sort of under the radar. The FBI was involved, and they wanted to take those people, those refugees, and turn them into an army and let them attack. So not our army wouldn't be attacking, but a Cuban nationalist army would be attacking, but with our help as far as training and money and all that kind of thing. And so they're going to have an invasion. So this will happen. They'll have an invasion here at the Bay of Pigs. So they're leaving Florida and going to different locations. Here, Puerto Rico, that was American as well, right? So that was all kind of an FBI deal. We're going to watch a little video here. What I'll tell you, it was an absolute, utter fiasco, an utter failure. Castro was ready for them. He fought back really well. All the guys were captured. So remember, these guys are Cuban, right? They're Cuban guys. Some killed, of course. Let's watch a little video and catch up on it.
March 1961, Guatemala. The CIA quietly gathers a brigade of about 1,500 civilians and trains them. The U.S. is preparing an assault on Castro and his government. This time, it's all or nothing. The CIA is about to start a war. The U.S.-backed insurgents are preparing for a landing at a place that will become infamous: the Bay of Pigs. Castro's intelligence knew well in advance about the U.S. plans. From inside Havana, the U.S. attack seems to be going badly from the start. Castro quickly kills or captures the Brigade of Exiles. The exiles are held for a year and a half. Castro visits them.
And he came very nicely saying, "Boys, how is the revolution treating you?" Almost in a paternal way. He managed to get a good number of us to applaud him for what he was saying. Okay, that showed me that this man had an ability of persuasion that, again, is not common among political leaders.
After the Bay of Pigs, the CIA's own top-secret report dubs the operation the perfect failure. It is said the Kennedys don't like to lose. In the aftermath of the failed Bay of Pigs, the president and his brother, the U.S. Attorney General, are more determined than ever to get Castro.
All right, so this was essentially another failure for the Kennedy administration, and furthermore, Castro had made a new friend. So that's Nikita Khrushchev right there. He went over to Russia, and they, he said, Khrushchev said, "I will help you, against America this way," because America was showing this aggression, you see. And so then we're going to see another issue that was very touchy for the Kennedy administration. And what that was is that the Russians brought down missiles, and these missiles were put in place and aimed right at America, okay? So now the Cubans are saying that they had been attacked, right? And therefore they had the right to defend themselves. But the missiles that were brought in were massive and nuclear armed missiles. And look where they could reach, all over the United States. All right, so this became a very, very scary position right here. And Kennedy had to do something. So here he is. Now his brother is Robert Kennedy, and he actually served in his brother's administration as his attorney general. All right, so, and of course they're very close, they're brothers, and they're discussing these things. Many people were kind of concerned about the too close of a connection, kind of a nepotism thing going on there. In fact, after this, it became, pretty much not allowed to hire your family members to be in top cabinet positions. So he and his brother were trying to negotiate. Now, his brother in particular negotiated with some Russian diplomats to try to see about how can they manage these missiles. And so we're going to see the first thing they're going to end up doing is to put up a U.S. blockade. Now, this is a naval blockade, so we have Navy ships out here, and the ships there are going to stop and intercept any Russian ships that are coming in and not allow them to bring in more weapons. I mean, there's already these missiles in here. We saw the missiles because one of our spy planes was able to take a picture of it, and it became very clear that they were missiles, and we were pretty sure that they were nuclear-armed missiles. Now, this U.S. blockade, however, tends to be an indication of aggression toward the Russians, right? So not toward Cuba, but toward the Russians. And so this was looking very, they were getting very nervous. The whole world actually was getting very nervous at this point, because that's sort of an act of war, if you will. But now the U.S. said, well, we're not blocking, food and stuff from coming in. We're just blocking weaponry from coming in. So here we have this struggle that's going on, right? They're both sitting on these bombs. They're both touching almost touching the buttons. And so we're looking at the idea of mutually assured destruction, MAD, right? And the whole world is saying, well, we're all going to suffer from your nuclear disaster you're fixing to have. So let's watch a little video.
It's not hard to imagine a world where at any given moment, you and everyone you know could be wiped out without warning, at the push of a button. This was the reality for millions of people during the 45-year period after World War II, now known as the Cold War. As the United States and Soviet Union faced off across the globe, each knew that the other had nuclear weapons capable of destroying it. And destruction never loomed closer than during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, the U.S. unsuccessfully tried to overthrow Cuba's new communist government. That failed attempt was known as the Bay of Pigs, and it convinced Cuba to seek help from the USSR. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was happy to comply by secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba, not only to protect the island, but to counteract the threat from U.S. missiles in Italy and Turkey. By the time U.S. intelligence discovered the plan, the materials to create the missiles were already in place. At an emergency meeting on October 16, 1962, military advisors urged an airstrike on missile sites and invasion of the island. But President John F. Kennedy chose a more careful approach. On October 22nd, he announced that the U.S. Navy would intercept all shipments to Cuba. There was just one problem. A naval blockade was considered an act of war. Although the president called it a quarantine that did not block basic necessities, the Soviets didn't appreciate the distinction. In an outraged letter to Kennedy, Khrushchev wrote, "The violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind toward the abyss of world nuclear missile war." Thus ensued the most intense 6 days of the Cold War. While the U.S. demanded the removal of the missiles, Cuba and the USSR insisted they were only defensive. And as the weapons continued to be armed, the U.S. prepared for a possible invasion. On October 27th, a spy plane piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson was shot down by a Soviet missile. The same day, a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine was hit by a small depth charge from a U.S. Navy vessel trying to signal it to come up. The commanders on the sub, too deep to communicate with the surface, thought war had begun and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. That decision had to be made unanimously by 3 officers. The captain and political officer both authorized the launch, but Vasily Arkhipov, second in command, refused. His decision saved the day, and perhaps the world. But the crisis wasn't over. For the first time in history, the U.S. military set itself to DEFCON 2, the defense readiness one step away from nuclear war. With hundreds of nuclear missiles ready to launch, the metaphorical doomsday clock stood at 1 minute to midnight. But diplomacy carried on. In Washington, D.C., Attorney General Robert Kennedy secretly met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. After intense negotiation, they reached the following proposal. The U.S. would remove their missiles from Turkey and Italy and promise to never invade Cuba in exchange for the Soviet withdrawal from Cuba under UN inspection. Once the meeting had concluded, Dobrynin cabled Moscow, saying time is of the essence and we shouldn't miss the chance. And at 9 a.m. the next day, a message arrived from Khrushchev announcing the Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. The crisis was now over. While criticized at the time by their respective governments for bargaining with the enemy, contemporary historical analysis shows great admiration for Kennedy and Khrushchev's ability to diplomatically solve the crisis. But the disturbing lesson was that a slight communication error or split-second decision by a commander could have thwarted all their efforts, as it nearly did, if not for Vasily Arkhipov's courageous choice. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed just how fragile human politics are compared to the terrifying power they can unleash.
All right, wow. So yeah, it was very tricky right then. Now, it continued, though, to have this competition between the Russians and USA. And I will say that Kennedy felt at the time that it showed sort of a weakness, that it was sort of a failure, even though, of course, he got the missiles out. And furthermore, they didn't quite report the part of us taking our missiles out of Turkey and Italy in America. So that was a little bit of a kind of quiet, on the quiet side. But another way of pursuing this Cold War, or this was the space race, right? So this idea of taking over in space. We saw that started last time about guys getting up into space. And so here is Kennedy making a speech, and he said that we want to put a man on the moon in this decade. So he said, I mean, he really laid it down. He said, we want to get a guy on the moon in the 1960s, and that was going to take a lot to do. But he made the challenge, and we're going to see how this is going to develop here. The next project after Mercury was Project Gemini. Gemini is the sign, the zodiac sign of the twins. And so Gemini was represented. There would be two astronauts in there. So we see the two guys in here, whereas the previous one only had one guy, and this will have two guys in there. And they're going to start testing out how does the human body act in weightlessness, and what all can they do up there as they're orbiting, how long can they stay up there, and this kind of thing. And one of the things that this project did was that they had the first spacewalk. So this is Ed White. He's the first guy to actually step out of the capsule, and he's in a spacesuit, of course, right there. And he was tethered to the module. I think you can see that right here, yeah. And then he went out. Well, he has his camera, right? And he can take some really great pictures of the Earth and pictures of the module. And so we call that a spacewalk. And they can do a couple things. They can float around out there. They can actually, in other future ones, they're actually fixing things on the outside. They're practicing by fixing parts of the module from the outside, kind of a deal. And this is all in an effort to think, if I'm out in space and I need to do this, this is how we're going to manage it. Meanwhile, we have the Cold War heating up over there in Indochina. We used to be called French Indochina because the French had a colony over there. But Kennedy is going to continue the effort that started really with Truman, right? The idea of containment, and had carried on through to the Eisenhower administration, and that is to try to stop the communism from taking over, and there would be this. This domino effect, that if one fell, the rest would fall, and that we need to stop that. We're going to stand over here and keep it from all going communist. And so we have a problem specifically in Indochina. So here, Indochina is this little peninsula right down here. And like I said, it was called French Indochina. And in World War II, of course, the Japanese came in here and kicked the French out. But the French came back afterwards. We will have a split of the North and South Vietnam here, sort of a splitting up after World War II kind of a thing. And we're going to see that there are communists. Here's China, right? They're communist with Chairman Mao up there. And then up here in North Vietnam is communist. Okay, and so we're going to see there's going to be a threat to South Vietnam. I think I'll have a better map here in just a minute where you'll be able to see it. Yeah, so here's North Vietnam, and then there's a little border here, and then South Vietnam. There's a country right next to them, all right, called Laos. And here, Kennedy is giving a speech and talking about how there has been some incursions of the North Vietnamese into Laos along the way. Let me show you the next picture here. Along the way, there's a trail right here where they'll get into South Vietnam by way of the trail through Laos. Okay, and so they're not directly coming across the border, but they are coming in this way. Okay, and this trail was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ho Chi Minh is a man who was trying to become the leader of the communists. And so, I think there was going to be like an election and everything. And so the Kennedy administration was concerned that he was going to take over and bring communism down into South Vietnam. Furthermore, there are people in South Vietnam who are pro-communist. All right, so they want Ho Chi Minh to come in, and then there are others who do not. So the United States is trying to support a non-communist regime down in the South. So we have we've sent troops over now. So Kennedy will send troops over. They're training the South Vietnamese troops to fight against the North Vietnamese troops. But there's also the South Vietnamese who form their own troops. So as those North Vietnamese are coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, making the trail bigger and bigger as they come so it's more and more accessible, they are recruiting some unhappy Vietnamese who want to become part of their band, right? And so that group, so that would be the South Vietnamese communists, are called the Viet Cong. Okay, so the Viet Cong. I think I'll show a picture of somebody like that in a minute. But we did, for the government of South Vietnam, we're supporting them by bringing troops in to train their troops. We specifically brought in helicopters to help with transport and reconnaissance and things like this. So this is the president of South Vietnam, okay? His name is, we're going to pronounce it Diem, okay, like a Z. President Diem. His name is Ngo Dinh Diem. All right. And he was very anti-communist. I mean, hugely anti-communist. But he was also Catholic, which was unusual because the vast majority of the people in South Vietnam, like 70% of them, are Buddhist. And so this Catholic president starts to implement Catholic ideas. In fact, at one point he had some big celebration to dedicate the the peninsula to the Virgin Mary, and that sort of alienated the Buddhists. And the Buddhists they had a not a revolt so much, but they wanted to protest. So they had a protest against Diem. So they were unhappy with that. He furthermore, when he found out about these Viet Cong types that were communists in their midst, he started having them arrested in huge numbers and executed. So some of those guys got executed, some were kept in camps, some of course escaped up to North Vietnam. All right, so now we're looking at Kennedy dealing with serious unrest in Vietnam. The Americans are supporting South Vietnam. He had already sort of lost that Berlin battle because the wall was up. He had somewhat of an embarrassing situation over in the Bay of Pigs. And so now he's very intent upon South Vietnam going his way. And so at one point, the people of South Vietnam, there were some diplomats who said, if we could throw Diem out and get rid of him and get somebody else in there who more represents the people, then we might have a better chance. And so they approached America to say, would you be in favor of a coup to have him ousted from power? And at first, Kennedy said yes, he did. Later, he said, I should have consulted others before making this decision, but it was put in motion. And so the South Vietnamese, with the quote-unquote blessing of Kennedy, went ahead and started the coup. All right, so a coup usually means the military, right? So the military is going to come in and throw him out. He and his brother were apprehended. They were put in a trunk of a car, and then they were assassinated. Okay, so he was killed, and so the rest of the world says that the assassination was ordered by John F. Kennedy, right? So even though he didn't do that, he had given his permission, if you will, his approval, his tacit approval for this coup. So I don't believe that was the way they wanted this to go, but that's how it went. Now this, by the way, is 1963 when this is taking place. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. We will come back to that war, don't worry. Yeah. So during the Kennedy administration, we have the Supreme Court of the United States. Here it is. It's called the Warren Court, and it's named after the Chief Justice right here, Chief Justice Warren. All right? And he sort of leads these guys into it had been moving this way a little bit before this, but the idea of an activist court to hear arguments for something that they would approve or disapprove, and instead of just saying constitutional, unconstitutional, they would sort of legislate from the bench. They would make new laws. And that's supposed to be the job of the House of Representatives, right? They're supposed to make the laws, and then the Senate is supposed to change those and approve those, and the president signs them, and then the court is supposed to do its job of judicial review. But in this particular case, we're going to see several cases that come down that these guys are just making the decision for everyone. So people would call that an activist court. So some of the important cases you'll be reading about in your homework right here. So in 62, 63, 65, 66, this was all Warren. Earl Warren was the Chief Justice during this time. So we have these first two, Engel v. Vitale and Abingdon School versus Shemp. Both of these have to do with religion in school and how some people are going to feel alienated by that. So this one is about you can't force someone to have prayer in school. So basically prayer is taken out of school. And then we have Bible reading in school. So since some people were offended, it's going to be taken out of school and declared unconstitutional to read the Bible in school. We have Griswold v. Connecticut. And we have right here a access to birth control to conception. And then probably the most familiar, you might be familiar with this, you'll be reading about all of these. Miranda versus Arizona, which was the idea that when someone gets arrested, you cannot use their words to incriminate them. So it's protection from self-incrimination. And it ended up with these things called the Miranda rights or the Miranda warning, which you probably, if you've watched any cop shows, you know this. You have the right to remain silent. This has to be told to everybody who's being arrested. It has to be. If they do not read these to you, then they will have arrested you unconstitutionally. So all these things have to be read to you. Hopefully you'll never be in a position where somebody's reading these rights to you, right? Yeah. Okay. Meanwhile, legislating now. So poor Kennedy's dealing with these problems of foreign policy that are quite difficult. And but he's also got problems at home, and that would be civil rights are still a big problem. So here's this quote. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. And so he truly believed that, and he wanted to encourage the rights, everyone's rights in all of the states, because there was still quite a problem with the down in the South, right? And especially in the South. Okay, so we're going to be looking at particularly some of the groups up north. So some of the groups who are going to be looking for civil rights, the civil rights groups, they're activist groups, are going to start these freedom rides. They get on buses and they drive down all the way through the South. And in the 60s, we'll see a little video in a second, but in the 60s, they were actually integrated groups, so blacks and whites together, coming down to say, hey, we're here in support of freedom for all, and we want to just rally the people to show that we can all live together. And it's kind of interesting as buses. Remember the bus situation last time. Now in Alabama, things went badly when one of the freedom buses was attacked by other cars who drove it off, who'd forced it off the road and then threw little incendiary bombs at it. And it caught on fire. No one was killed in this particular case, but it was close, and it was very frightening, and some people were hurt indeed. Here's just a short video to kind of talk about.
The original Freedom Rides took place in 1947 and were part of the Journey of Reconciliation, which was sponsored by the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the Congress of Racial Equality. The Freedom Rides were inspired by two Supreme Court decisions, one in 1946 and one in 1960. In those two decisions, the United States Supreme Court ruled that segregation in interstate commerce was unconstitutional. The original Freedom Ride from 1947 was conceived of by activists George Hauser and Bayard Rustin, and originally only included men. In 1961, when the Congress of Racial Equality resurrected the idea of a Freedom Ride, it would include both men and women in mixed interracial groups. The Freedom Riders encountered extreme violence as they began their journey through the South in an effort to ensure that the states were abiding by the Supreme Court's rulings. Shortly into the Freedom Rides, the Congress of Racial Equality decided to abandon the protests because of the violence that they were facing. The worst incidents of violence directed at the Freedom Riders took place in Anniston, Alabama, when the buses they were riding on were bombed. A new civil rights group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee actually took up the cause of the Freedom Rides after CORE dropped out. television proved to be a great ally for the Freedom Riders. As Americans witnessed the brutality being visited on the riders, public opinion turned against Southern segregationists.
Okay, so eventually things were going to work out, but it was going to be really tough getting there. So Alabama tended to be kind of a hot spot for all this. Birmingham in particular, which we saw some of that last week. This man is named Bull Connor, that's his nickname, but Bull Connor was part of the Birmingham Public Safety Commission, and he was in charge, I suppose, of keeping the place safe. So when there were protests of any kind in Alabama, where the African American community went out on a march or something like this, and furthermore, the Freedom Rides did come there, so those buses were there as well. Well, Bull Connor was there to fight against them, and he said, "You cannot have your assembly here. It is an illegal assembly." He used everything he could within the law, whatever the laws were right then. And for instance, right here you can see he had dogs attack, right? So awful. And then one of the most famous deals was these were nonviolent protesters. He opens up the fire hoses on them like this. Okay, so there are actually people out there who defend his peacekeeping efforts right here, but the one article I read was an entirely racist article, so I just don't, I don't see how this can be justified. In Birmingham, we have this church on the 16th Street Baptist Church. I want you to take a look here at these stairs right here. There's like a door right under here. Well, in 1963, there were 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan bombed it. Okay, so they had that like a device underneath those steps I just showed you right there, and it exploded. And what happened was there were some people in it, and it was actually these 4 little girls, ages like 8 to 11 or something. It was just awful, and they were killed. And so, like the video was saying, as far as television was starting to report these things, all right, so people are starting to become outraged because this is obviously not the way that we want America to be, right? I will tell you that these 4 members, while people knew who they were, only one of them ended up getting prosecuted, and that was several years later. So it was really incredibly, an incredible lack of justice there. Meanwhile, over in Mississippi, we have Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers had grown up in Mississippi and basically, loved the state. It's a beautiful state. And he had gone off to fight in the war, became a hero, fighting alongside others. He was actually in the D-Day invasions. And when he was there, he saw how basically we could be integrated together and everybody got along really well. And he really liked the idea of that. But when he got back home to Mississippi, that was all gone. And he said, well, he wanted to be one of the people to help change that, to help bring that integration and just that equality, just so that they could have the same quality of life as everyone else. So he actually joined the NAACP. He met a woman and got married and had some children, and he's working for the NAACP, and he's going out for the NAACP and encouraging people in Mississippi, in different towns of Mississippi, to have boycotts against groups that will not treat African Americans fairly, to have investigations into African Americans who have been attacked or otherwise harassed by people in the area. And so he was very, bold about that. He oftentimes was concerned that he was for his own life. And at one point, he would actually he would have the police sort of following him around for his protection. But one night when he was coming home, in his own driveway, he was assassinated by someone, and he was discovered by his wife later, took him to the hospital, but he died there. But his story was covered very thoroughly in the news, and that really helped to bring about some advancement to this. And furthermore, it helped this man because he's going to give some speeches. You probably recognize this guy. This is Martin Luther King Jr., a minister from Georgia, and he was the great voice of the African American movement at the time. In 1963, he led a march on Washington, where they marched up there, and when they got to Washington, he gave a speech, probably the most famous speech he ever had given. I have a little clip of it right here. They're actually standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial when he gave this speech. You will read it this week in your assignment, and I encourage you to read the whole thing. It's really quite good, but this is probably the most famous quote from it.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. One day.
So that's the I Have a Dream speech. Of course, it goes on, and it's very good, and such a great quote right there. And you can hear that that minister, type of voice there. He's giving a sermon right here, right? And so he is invoking God and all that in this as well. And so he made a huge impact and helped to keep leading this in the direction of the freedom. All right, so we are in 1963, and I mentioned earlier that Kennedy had taken LBJ as his running mate because Texas had been a little bit shaky on their support of him. And so it was LBJ who suggested that he come on down to Texas and give some speeches and let everybody see that he was a good Democrat, right? And so there were plans. He was coming to Dallas first, and then he was actually going to be coming over to Austin for a dinner afterwards. He's not going to make it, okay? So here are he and Jackie headed, just landing at Love Airfield, and then you're going to get in the motorcade to go on a drive, through town for people to say, hey, this is the president, right? Everybody's going to see him and wave. Here he is in a car with his wife. Here's him. And this is the governor of Texas. His name is John Connally. And John Connally's wife is over there. I don't know if you can see her very well. And then we have a driver up front and a Secret Service agent right here. Okay, so they're driving through Dallas in a place called Dealey Plaza. And you can see right here, they're coming up. So they turned from this road, and they're coming up here, Houston Street. And then they're going to make a turn down Elm Street. So this is called Dealey Plaza. And as they're coming down Elm Street right here, there is somebody in this building right here called the Texas School Book Depository. All right, so we think he was right up in here. And as the motorcade went past, there was a shot that came here from behind. Okay, now this area right here is known as the Grassy Knoll. It's just a little hill. Now, mind you, there were people all along here, standing here, waving at the president. All right, so we can see a shot rang out from this area. So here's what the building looks like. It's still there. I believe it's a museum today. And if that's the right window, I think it was one of these, maybe one of these top windows here. This man's name is Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, here's the story. Here's the official story, is that he was up in this building with a long rifle. He was a sniper. He had actually been in the Army. He was a communist. I mean, he was a sympathizer. He had visited Russia. And so the idea here is that he didn't like Kennedy because Kennedy was anti-communist, something like this. But believe you me, there are all sorts of conspiracy theories here. There are plenty of people, you should ask your parents what they think, plenty of people, maybe your grandparents, who think that he didn't do it and that he was just a pawn and that somebody else bigger did it. In fact, some people think that whole Grassy Knoll situation, that somebody actually fired a shot from here, which would be in front of the car, versus here, which is in back of the car. Okay, there's ideas it could have been Castro's people. It could have been LBJ. Some people thought that he might be responsible for that. It could be the mob who hated that Kennedy was going after organized crime. There's all sorts of different theories out there. The official story, though, is that it was Lee Harvey Oswald. So Oswald did this. He actually got away. And then we'll see what happens to him in a minute. So at this point in time, so we're looking at here, this is an interesting shot because it is a still from a video camera that was being held by somebody who was watching the president go by. His name was Zapruder, Mr. Zapruder. So this is the Zapruder film. And what's happening right here is what the official word is there is a bullet has come from the Texas School Book Depository right down here. It has come down here through the president's neck and into John Connally. So John Connally was shot that day too. He survived, but he was shot that day. And you see the president here is holding on to his neck right there. Remember he had a back issue, remember the boat incident and all that kind of stuff. He was wearing a back brace to help him with the pain in his back. So he was unable to bend over kind of naturally right there. All right, so then the next shot would come in the back of his head right here, okay? And that would kill him. When that happened, at this point, the driver realizes what's going on and starts to drive away quickly. So what we have is his head goes backward like this, and that's why some people think he was shot in the front of the head. Don't know. You can, like I said, ask somebody what they think. Here's people. They're all running, of course, at this point. Here's the driver, and I don't know why this guy's not helping anybody. Here is the governor. He's down. He's protecting his wife. Here's the president right here. At this point, he has a gunshot wound in the back of his head. And this is his wife reaching back to the Secret Service agents right over here. Just a heart-wrenching photograph right there. The president was taken to Parkland Hospital there in Dallas, and he was pronounced dead a little later that day. It was pretty hopeless when they got him there. So it was pretty obvious that, he was not going to survive that wound. Very sad. Shocking to the whole nation. In some places covered live, Now, Oswald was captured later that day. He actually had walked out of the school book depository, and because of the chaos, right, he was able to get away, and he's moving through the town. And they ended up, as far as I remember, they found him like in a movie theater, watching a movie, I think. And they were able to arrest him and take him in. Now, you notice he's got a little bit of, been roughed up a little bit right here. Maybe he resisted arrest, something like this. And of course, all these people are very emotional because their president has just been killed, and perhaps they got the guy right here who's done it, right? So he's in jail, not talking. They're not really getting much out of him. He's asking for his lawyer and things like this. And the next day, or maybe 2 days later, he is going to be transferred from one location in Dallas to another location. And when that happened, as they were walking him through, another man comes up and shoots Lee Harvey Oswald and killed him. All right, that man was Jack Ruby, which this means we never got any confession from Lee Harvey Oswald to explain his reasoning for why he did this. Furthermore, Jack Ruby went to jail for murdering Lee Harvey Oswald, and he never disclosed why he did it. So some people say he was a low-rent mobster, and he was trying to keep Oswald quiet because he would implicate the mob, something like this. But we don't know. He died in jail, actually, so we're not sure what Jack Ruby's. He said what he said was he was a fan of JFK and was upset about the assassination. All right, so here we are on the plane. This is Air Force One, and Lyndon Johnson is being sworn in on Air Force One. Look who's right next to him. So there's Jackie Kennedy. Her blood. She's got blood on her clothes right here. Just shocked look. Her husband is in a coffin in the hold of the airplane right there. So LBJ's being sworn in. This is his wife right over here, and he becomes the president now. Just horrible time. This is the funeral of the president. Jackie Kennedy was in charge of this, and she wanted to make it very similar to what had gone on with Lincoln's assassination. So here's the motorcade coming down right here. And then one of the sweetest pictures right here, we see little John saluting his father. And there's Caroline. Here is a brother, that's Edward Kennedy, and here's brother, Robert Kennedy. So he's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. You can go and see his grave, and he has this called the Eternal Flame. The flame is always burning right there. Okay. All right. So Lyndon Baines Johnson, like I said, was a Texan. He was a teacher. He grew up in the Hill Country. In fact, the city where he was living is now called Johnson City, named after him. Here he is as a child right here. He becomes president number 36. I also mentioned earlier he was a great legislator. And so that he's going to continue to be that as a president. In other words, he's going to try to accomplish everything through lots and lots of laws being passed. Okay, he's going to work very closely with Congress to get laws passed. This is his wife, Lady Bird. That was his nickname for her, so she had the initials LBJ as well. She's responsible for, here in Texas, the bluebonnet planting along the highways. So she had implemented that earlier, and now, because she wanted the highways to be beautified by our state flower. I'm not sure if you know that we plant those, and every year we let them go to seed, and we mow, and they get replanted. So we have Lady Bird. If you notice, also along highways, right, you see lots of bluebonnets because we put them there. In 1964, Johnson's going to run against Goldwater it was 1963 when Kennedy was killed, so there was really just a year for LBJ to do some things, but we're going to see mostly what's going to happen is when he wins re-election here. So he's going to run against this man named Barry Goldwater. He wasn't unopposed to become the Democrat nominee, and neither was Goldwater for that matter. So there were kind of some contentious primaries going on here, but LBJ came out on top for the Democrats, and Goldwater came out on top for the Republicans. And Goldwater's an interesting character. He's very, very conservative, probably considered maybe libertarian by today's standards, but he seemed like he was more hawkish on the war. He wanted to pursue the war and make the war even more complex, like more soldiers going to war. And so that was one of the things that people thought that Johnson was maybe a little less a war hawk. And so Goldwater, by the way, was from Arizona. So LBJ was picking his vice presidential running mate, and he did not pick Robert Kennedy. A lot of people thought he should have taken Robert Kennedy as his vice president, but he did not. They didn't like each other. So he picked a guy named Hubert Humphrey as his running mate. Okay, the KKK came out in support of Goldwater. It's not that it wasn't that Goldwater was in favor of KKK. It's just that the KKK thought that he was less of a problem than LBJ. LBJ had been talking about civil rights and carrying on John F. Kennedy's civil rights agenda, and so they're thinking that he was against their racism, which I guess he was. But look at this in 1964. Boy, howdy, that is a big win, one of the biggest out there. We have the popular vote at 61, but look at the electoral, 90%. Okay, so Goldwater one of the reasons, I always wondered why Goldwater lost so badly, and one of the reasons was that there was a very famous political ad played where this ticking, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, a little girl's picking flowers in the field, and then there's a giant, nuclear bomb goes off. And they said basically that Goldwater was going to be in charge of the nuclear disaster. So people, it was fear. So LBJ used fear to defeat Goldwater. Notice something interesting though. So Goldwater was from Arizona, so he wins that state. Look here, we have some Republican states in the South. All right, so we're going to start to see a little bit of a turn in the South away from Democrat and toward Republican. It sort of kind of began here in 1964. All right, so in 64, LBJ did pass the Voting Rights Act, which was a legislation to say that there will be no more racism. Interesting how you can pass as many laws as you want, but you can't change somebody's heart. And so this did not help the cause at first, right? But it was an attempt to work at civil rights. He appointed the first African American to the Supreme Court. This is Thurgood Marshall. You might remember him from last week. He was the one that helped with the Brown versus the Board of Education. Here he is, right here. He served a long time on the court. But meanwhile, the South doesn't seem to really be complying with this new law, and there are going to be more marches. So here was a big march in Selma, Alabama. So they're going to be, Dr. Martin Luther King is there, along with a lot of people. Look, it looks like a big march going on there. And they are marching through the streets, and they came up with a plan, and the plan was to march all the way from Selma to Montgomery, just to make a statement. And in Selma, as they wanted to march toward Montgomery, there was an incident on a bridge called the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where the governor of Alabama was named George Wallace, and he sent out this military group here. So this is the state troopers, and he said, I want no march. This is illegal. I want you to stop them at all costs. And so they did. They sent tear gas. They used their nightsticks, to beat the people. Notice the state troopers are wearing gas masks because they're throwing out tear gas against these guys with nothing, who are just standing there. They're just walking, right? And they had even horses. Horses came in, and so as they started to push the crowd back, the crowd got trampled. Some of them were run over by the horses. It was just awful, and it's called Bloody Sunday essentially because these people were beaten up. Mostly they ended up going back to the church. There may have been some arrests there had previously been arrests. Martin Luther King was not there that particular day. He was back in Atlanta preaching. The decision basically had been made for him not to be there for the beginning of the march. Okay. which brings us to LBJ's philosophy of the Great Society right here. These are his things he wants to, remember I said he wants to put in a lot of legislation. Okay, so he has the war on poverty. He's got programs. These are government programs that are going to eliminate poverty. Then he's going to take on education. He's got, 60 separate bills to provide better schools. And probably the most long-lasting one would be here. Medicare and Medicaid were put into place by LBJ. He wanted to have measures to improve the environment. We have the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, so that's the government supporting the arts. That's kind of a new thing right there. The Job Corps, kind of like the Peace Corps, but here, to providing skills, sort of like, a little bit like maybe reminiscent of FDR's New Deal, right? Head Start would be a program for schools, for young schools in underdeveloped areas and things like this. So we called it the Great Society. And you can see there's lots and lots of government trying to answer the questions or the problems of society right here. Instead of like the church stepping up or morality in here, it's going to be legislated. And that is a very, what we might say today, a very liberal way of looking at the government. Though some people might call it the nanny state, the nanny taking care of us. But the Medicare has stuck around. It's still here. This is a program of health care for elderly people to keep them from being ignored. All right, Vietnam becomes pretty bad at this point. Okay, so at now we have a new commander. He's going to, commander-in-chief, that's LBJ. He's going to continue like Kennedy's policies, but he's going to be much more aggressive in there. And furthermore, he tends to be a micromanager. He's going to manage it from Washington, D.C. And he feels like he has, the answers, all the answers. William Westmoreland was put in charge over there, and then his Secretary of State is Robert McNamara. And these two guys are managing the war. They had been there for Kennedy, especially McNamara, and had been advising at the time, and now they're going to continue to advise. But ironically, where they accused Barry Goldwater of being a war hawk, this is going to become very heavy-duty war here. He's going to send more troops. All right, it kind of started with an incident. Let's see what the incident was.
The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, 1964, the Vietnam War. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, or the USS Maddox Incident, is the event responsible for America's entry into the Vietnam War. Vietnam was divided into halves, North and South, ruled by separate regimes, but the United States were concerned that Ho Chi Minh and the Communists would win the upcoming elections and were determined to stop the spread of communism. U.S. military involvement, however, had been minimal until 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson had been training South Vietnamese mercenaries, sending them into North Vietnam to carry out acts of sabotage and gather intel. On July 31, 1964, South Vietnamese commandos had attacked North Vietnamese targets in the Gulf of Tonkin. On August 2, 1964, American naval destroyers had moved into North Vietnam waters to gather intelligence on the enemy's naval strength. The USS Maddox was nearing the mouth of the river delta when Captain Herrick noticed that they were being followed by North Vietnamese torpedo boats and had intercepted communications of their intention to attack, so he fired 3 warning shots. The USS Maddox was then fired upon by the enemy torpedo boats. Captain Herrick retaliated and opened fire on the torpedo boats, and with the assistance of U.S. jet fighters, hit all 3 enemy targets. The enemy boats had fired their torpedoes, but they all missed. The USS Maddox then retreated back into international waters. 2 days later, a second patrol was launched into the Gulf of Tonkin by the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, when Captain Herrick reported that they were again under attack. Secretary McNamara and President Johnson agreed that retaliation was needed and the expansion of the war was approved by Congress. However, Herrick sent a later message claiming that he was mistaken about the attack and that freak weather action may have led his men to overreact. The final part of the message read, "No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken." Nevertheless, this was ignored by Johnson and his advisors, who continued on with the retaliation plan. On August 5th, Johnson made a public speech stating, "The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage." Shortly after his speech, U.S. aircraft bombed North Vietnamese targets, torpedo boat bases, and an oil storage depot. America was now drawn into the Vietnam War. President Johnson made a speech via the media to the American people to get their support for the war and described the attack on 2 U.S. Navy warships as a deliberate aggression. By late 1965, 200,000 American troops were on the ground, with more on the way.
So it escalated the war completely. And furthermore, and now when we look back, it's that Gulf of Tonkin incident was probably nothing. You're right, an overreaction. The whole thing, so the PT boats probably were just defending themselves, kind of a thing. All right, so our guys are now being sent over there in large numbers. It's a very tropical area. It's hot. They're going through these deep, watery. It was just awful. And like I said, this group called the Viet Cong. Now these are South Vietnamese who are fighting with the communists, and then the communists are they're part of the North Vietnamese army, right? So the NVA. And so now it's difficult for our soldiers to tell the difference, who's good and who's bad, who are the good guys. So they're going literally from, village to village, house to house, trying to figure out who's the bad guy. And so it was just almost an impossible task to figure out who are they fighting here. Meanwhile, as they're walking through the forest, they may come across these booby traps that they set all over the place, right? This is called a punji trap, or a box type of trap, where there'd be something over the top, and as the guys fell in, they would be impaled by these very, very sharp bamboo spikes that are down there. Another one here is a tripwire. So they're walking through the water and can't see very, through there, the murky water, and they'll trip this and they'll explode this, and it'll cause great damage right here. They even had snake pits where they would have a pit you would fall into with these, venomous viper snakes, and they're just horrible stuff, just nightmare type stuff. All right, so the Tet Offensive was probably, I don't know if it was a turning point. The Tet Offensive was an offensive by the North Vietnamese with the Viet Cong coming in through the Ho Chi Minh Trail and making several attacks. Now, Tet is a holiday. It's I want to kind of say like a New Year's. It's called the Lunar New Year, something like this. And so the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese were going to use this as a truce. All Vietnamese like to celebrate Tet. And so they called a ceasefire, but the Viet Cong and the NVA disregarded it, and they attacked anyway. Okay, notice it's here. It's quite a long ways right here, right? So they're going to keep attacking and keep attacking. But it did catch the U.S. troops off guard. They thought there was truly going to be a ceasefire. And the U.S. troops were surprised. The U.S. embassy was bombed. And then several months went by. Now, the U.S. will end up winning it in the end, okay? So the Tet Offensive will be a quote-unquote failure for the North Vietnamese, but there were so many losses. And here is one of the chief reasons that it was bad, was because the media were there the whole time reporting on it and showing everybody the ugly truth of the war.
The media, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is often referred to as the first television war. Media coverage showed the American public the reality of a foreign war, detached from the government's optimistic depiction, uncensored on their televisions at home. During the 1960s, there was a huge increase in television ownership in American households, and news shows became a popular source of information. Video technology was also improving, and lightweight portable camcorders and audio recording equipment allowed journalists and reporters to capture the war close up and in great quantity. This would prove problematic for the U.S. government when it came to censorship. Stories could be live or edited, which could be done rapidly with film being sent to and transmitted from Tokyo. In the first years of the war, the media portrayed a positive image of the conflict, with a clear U.S. victory in sight. News reports focused mainly on communism and the Cold War, and the U.S. government happily allowed journalists access to American troops and the Vietnam battlefield. The media started to move towards a negative stance, as it was apparent how brutal President Diem's regime was in the South. In the United States, the civil rights and anti-war movements influenced the mainstream media into criticism of U.S. policies. The number of correspondents increased as the war intensified. Most stayed in Saigon to report, but some went to the front lines and came across the same risks as the soldiers. Around 60 journalists were killed during the war. The unrestricted access given to correspondence became detrimental during the Tet Offensive in 1968, where a pessimistic, inevitable defeat was portrayed in the news. President Johnson would say upon watching CBS anchorman Walter Cronkite's report on Vietnam, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The controversy over the media's role in the eventual American defeat in the Vietnam War came about from the reporting on the Tet Offensive as a complete communist victory, which was misleading to the public. However, it is also argued by some historians that the media reporting during the Vietnam War was mainly reflective of the situation, and that it was largely supportive of the U.S. effort, with the main factor of American public disillusionment being the rising number of American casualties.
Okay, so that kind of shows the power of the press, which is still in place now, right? The power of the press to tell a story. And like they said, they reported the Tet Offensive as a complete failure, which, you know, in the end it wasn't, but at the beginning it was pretty bad. So, but they were sort of coloring it a little bit there. But this started the anti-war movement. It bolstered the anti-war movement, but even regular people started to say, well, I don't think I'm for this war anymore. There's too many of our guys being killed, and what for? But we have a lot of college students who don't want to have any part of it. These guys here would be of the age that can be drafted to go fight in the war that they don't believe in. But then we have just a bunch of regular people saying, yeah, we want out of the Vietnam War too. So it's the popular idea is to get out at this point. At this time, we have the hippie culture as well. They would have been probably war protesters, and then they're going to go live like an alternate lifestyle, right? They're going to kind of drop out, not be a part of the like regular times, right? In San Francisco had a particularly large hippie culture there. We call them hippies, and they met in a place, 2 streets here called Haight-Ashbury. So Haight Street and Ashbury Street right there in San Francisco. And this also brought on the Jesus movement, okay? So people known as Jesus freaks, they were sort of the dropout, but they were going to claim back the beauty of the Jesus, you know, purity kind of thing. Try Jesus. Really some interesting, you know, thinking came out here. Some people who were reading the Bible, I think it was a true thing. I know that we had some music part of it. This is Keith Green over here on the right, who was a true, you know, Christian who wrote these really amazing, you probably know some of his songs that he's written because they're still being done in churches today. But also some of the mainstream guys were like, here's a Doobie Brothers singing Jesus is just all right with me, you know, this kind of thing. So it was kind of a popular thing in music and pop culture is to talk up Jesus. John McCain was a war hero. He was over in Vietnam, and he actually was taken prisoner there, and he was a commander, and his father actually was a very important naval officer, and the Vietnamese knew that, and they offered John McCain his freedom, and he decided to not accept that until the rest of the men got their freedom as well. Let's see, we have a little video on here. How long is that? Let's see, let's watch.
I was Lieutenant Commander in the United States Navy, flying an A-4 Skyhawk. I was flying in a first major strike into Hanoi in October of 1967. Hanoi was still, to this day, the most heavily defended place as far as surface-to-air missiles are concerned. There was lots of them in the air that day. I was hit and ejected. My chute barely opened as my feet hit the water in a place they call the Western Lake in Hanoi. The Vietnamese swam out, pulled me in, and the people were very angry. I was bayoneted and my shoulder broken. The Vietnamese military came up and took me to what we know of as the Hanoi Hilton, the Wallow prison. I was in very bad shape. The Vietnamese believed I was dying, and then they found out through Western news media that I was the son of a high-ranking admiral. They took me to the hospital. They did give me blood, but other than that, the treatment wasn't exactly ideal. What they wanted was propaganda. They wanted war crimes confessions. They wanted condemnation of our country. They wanted people to speak against our country and the war. I refused. The Vietnamese put me in solitary confinement. I'd been through some very, very tough times, but other Americans who had been captured were being treated in the most unspeakable fashion.
I guess that's the end. Okay, so he ran for president a couple years back. Then comes 1968, so we need to go through this real quick and then we'll end. 1968 was a big year politically, right? Lyndon B. Johnson was not popular because of the war mostly. And he said, I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. So now we're going to look for a new candidate, right? So Nixon now sees his chance. Remember, he had run against John F. Kennedy and had lost in that very, very close election. Now he's come back and he wants to run as the Republican. But look who wants to run as the Democrat. Robert Kennedy, very popular, you know, the brother of the slain president and this kind of thing. Right, but he wasn't alone in the Democrat deal. Hubert Humphrey, who had been the vice president of LBJ, also wanted to run. Furthermore, we had a candidate. This is George Wallace. He's the governor of Alabama, the really racist one. And he wants to, be the party of non-segregation, right? Non-integration. He wanted to be the party of segregation, keeping the races separate. So it's kind of a crowded field there. And Martin Luther King is at this point. So this is 1968. He is in Memphis at this point going to give a speech. And he's at the Lorraine Motel. And as he's there coming out early in the morning, shots ring out. And he was assassinated. There was I'm not sure exactly where they're pointing, but there was somebody up here who shot and killed Martin Luther King Jr. Very sad. And Robert Kennedy was the one who reported. He was out on the campaign trail, and he reported that Martin Luther King had been killed. So very sad. And he gave an impassioned speech at that point in time. So Robert Kennedy was well on the way to becoming the candidate, the Democrat candidate for president. He went out to California to make a speech at the Ambassador Hotel. Here he is, giving a speech. There's his wife, and they are, feted and treated like royalty almost, and they get there. But as he was leaving, he was walking away through a back entrance through like a kitchen area, and as he was going through there, a man stepped out and shot him. So assassinated him as well. He died that night at the Ambassador Hotel. The guy that shot him, I think he was unbalanced. His name was Sirhan, and I'm not sure exactly what his motivation. They caught him. I think he was a bellboy or a waiter or something at the hotel. But now he is dead, and so now there's going to be a convention. Who's going to be nominated? So who gets left? Well, it's Humphrey right here. Is going to be nominated for the Democrat nominee, and they have their convention in Chicago. But the Democrat Party is split. They're split. There's the racist situation going on, so that's one part of it. But the other part is the war. Is Humphrey going to be pro-war? Is he going to be get the guys out of the war? But there's a huge, even in the convention itself, there's trouble. So inside the convention, look, we have people opening up signs and showing those and causing a trouble there. But more so outside, we have people rioting. And so the police have to come in and arrest all sorts of protesters out there, mostly war protesters. So big trouble in Chicago. So 1968 election takes place, and we can see here that Nixon wins. Okay, Nixon did promise to get out of the war. All right, and so Humphrey won a few places. You see here, but look at there in the South. This is Wallace, right? The racist guy right there. All right, so 68 was crazy. So now we have Richard Nixon is the new president of the United States. So what I'll probably do, y'all, is end here, and we'll just cover Nixon's administration next week, because I'm kind of out of time right here. Okay, so but we're going to see. So he's going to carry it, and we'll look into the 70s and what happened in the 70s. Okay, very good. Thanks, y'all. I will see you next week. All right.